Wyoming Territory, 1879, the wind came down off the bighorns sharp as a blade, and the town of Red Butte stood quiet under a gray morning sky as Maebry Harlowe stepped off the stagecoach, clutching her carpetbag like it was the only thing holding her upright. She had not spoken during the ride. The other passengers had not minded. Her boots hit the earth, and she looked around a livery, a general store, small church, and a saloon with a broken sign swinging on one hinge. She swallowed hard. It was not much, but it was far enough from Missouri that no one here would know her past. Or her stutter. A gust of wind tugged her shawl loose, and as she bent to catch it, a man stepped out of the saddlery across the street. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sunburnt skin and a way of moving that said he had seen more than his share of hard days. He wore a brown hat low over his eyes and a pistol at his hip that looked well used. He noticed her just as she straightened. Their eyes met. He gave a nod. Not a smile, just a quiet acknowledgement. Maebry looked away first. She made her way to the boarding house, where the landlady handed her a key without much chatter. "Room upstairs, supper's at 6, the woman said, already turning back to her ledger. Alone in the small room, Maebry sat down on the edge of the bed and let out a breath she had been holding for weeks. She had come to Red Butte to teach in the one-room schoolhouse. It was the only place that would take her after the last town had let her go, not for lack of skill, but because the children laughed when she tried to speak and the parents followed suit. That night at supper, she listened. The ranch hands talked about cattle. The blacksmith cursed about horseshoes. A man at the end of the table joked about a woman who could not get through a sentence without tripping over her own tongue. Laughter roared. Maebry's cheeks burned. She kept her head down. Across the table, the cowboy from the saddlery was watching. The next morning, she walked to the schoolhouse with her books hugged tight to her chest. The children watched her with open curiosity, but they did not speak much, not yet. Maebry taught them letters, numbers, reading. She wrote everything on the chalkboard. She did not speak more than she had to. That afternoon, on her way back into town, she passed the saddlery. The cowboy was outside, brushing down a chestnut gelding. He looked up. "You're the new schoolteacher," he said. She nodded. He tilted his head. "Got a name?" She hesitated. "M. Maebry." "M. Maebry H. Harlowe." He did not flinch, did not chuckle. His eyes stayed steady on hers, a quiet warmth there. "I'm Kallen Oakes," he said. "Good to meet you, Maebry." She blinked. "Why you? You said it, my name, all of it." "Of course I did," he said simply. "I'll listen to every word you have to say." It stopped her cold. No one had ever said that to her before, not her father, not the children at school, not the pastors who told her to pray more, or the doctor who told her to speak less. She stared at him, and something in her chest shifted just a crack, but it let light in. That night, Maebry sat by the oil lamp in her room, her fingers trembling over the pages of her journal. She had written in it since she was 8, since the stutter started. It was the only place she could say what she really meant, but now, someone had listened. For real, the next few days passed quiet and steady. She taught, she walked, she stayed out of people's way, but sometimes she passed the saddlery and Kallen would lift a hand in greeting. One day he handed her a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Saw these on the trail, thought you might like them," he said. She took them with careful fingers. Thank you," he nodded. "You're welcome." Later that week, a group of boys at school whispered and laughed when she struggled through a lesson. She tried to ignore it, but the hurt lodged deep. After class, she sat alone, her hands in her lap, throat tight. The door creaked. Kallen stood there in the doorway. "I was riding past," he said. "Saw you sitting here." She looked up. You do not have to say anything." She did anyway. I see can't be a TT teacher if they don't respect me." "You are already a teacher," he said. "They will learn." "They're just slow." She gave a small, shaky smile. He crossed the room, crouched beside her so they were level. "You do not need to change a thing about yourself, Maebry. The world can bend a little for once." The tears came fast and quiet. She did not speak. He did not move. Just sat beside her until she was ready to walk back to town. After that, something changed. The children grew quieter, more respectful. She did not know what Kallen had done or said, but she saw him one morning talking to their parents out by the mercantile, his voice low and firm. 1 week later, she found a note tucked inside her classroom door, in a child's handwriting. "You are the best teacher we ever had." The days grew warmer. Spring crept in slow, and the air smelled of sage and dust. One evening, Maebry walked out past the edge of town just to breathe. She found Kallen sitting on a fence, watching the sun go down. He looked over when she approached. "Evening? Evening." He patted the fence beside him. She climbed up. They watched the sky turn gold and then pink. Kallen reached over, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "I like hearing you talk," she swallowed. I'll like talking to you," he smiled, then a real one. "You ever think of staying, for good?" She blinked. I am here. I mean really stay, build something together," her breath caught. She looked at him, really looked, and saw at the steadiness, the kindness, the quiet strength in his hands and voice. And he saw her too, not the broken pieces, but the whole of her. Maebry nodded. "I would like that." He leaned in slow, careful, and kissed her soft and real, the way you do when you know it means something. And Maebry Harlowe, who had once been mocked for every word she tried to say, kissed him back without fear, without shame, only hope. The wind that came through Red Butte in late spring was softer than the one that brought Maebry in, carrying the smells of blooming chokecherry and damp earth. She began wearing her hair looser, the ends brushing the collar of her dress, and the children noticed she smiled more, not wide, just enough to show she wasn't holding her breath all day. Kallen built a bench beside the door of the schoolhouse. He didn't say he was doing it. She simply arrived one morning and found it there, smooth pine, sanded edges, a place for her to sit and rest before the bell. He passed by on horseback not long after. "You made that," she said, her hands folded in her lap. He tipped his hat, still mounted. "Thought you might need a spot to catch your breath before wrangling all those minds." Maebry traced the grain of the wood with one finger. It's be beautiful. Figured it ought to be if you were gonna sit on it." His gaze lingered a beat longer than it used to. "You busy after the bell?" She shook her head. "Ride with me then," he said. She hesitated, then nodded. That afternoon, he brought a second horse, a gelding with a calm gait and a dark dapple coat. Kallen helped her into the saddle without drawing attention to her inexperience. She held the reins tight, but he didn't tease. Just rode alongside her, slow enough for her to learn the rhythm. They left the town behind, following a narrow trail that cut through low hills and scattered cottonwoods. A hawk circled overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a creek murmured through stone. "I never learned to ride," she said once the silence between them had stretched comfortably. "You're doin' just fine," he answered. Horse knows when someone's gentle. Maebry watched the sway of the trees ahead, the way the sun filtered through new leaves. "I didn't know Wyoming would be so quiet," he glanced at her. "It's a loud place if you know how to listen." They crested a ridge, and below she saw a wide field bordered by cottonwoods, a cabin nestled near the edge, smoke rising from its chimney. A split-rail fence traced its perimeter, and a few cattle grazed close by. "That's yours?" she asked. "Built it myself," he said. "Took me 2 years and a busted thumb." They stopped their horses at the fence line. He dismounted first, then helped her down. "I wasn't always a saddle man," he said, resting against the rail. "My folks were from Arkansas, came west when I was 16. Pa didn't last the first winter." Maebry kept her eyes on the field. "I'm sorry. Don't be. Taught me how to plant fence posts and keep dry wood. Taught me how to wait out a storm." She looked at him then, really looked. His face was worn in places that didn't come from age. The kind of wear that came from burying things too young. "I lost my mother when I was 12. Fever. She sang to me always. Said it didn't matter if I couldn't say the words right." Kallen nodded slowly. "She sounds like she knew what mattered." They didn't speak for a while. The breeze shifted and the air carried the scent of wild onions. "You ever think about having your own land?" he asked. She blinked. "I don't know how. You'll learn. I have no one here. You got me." Maebry's hand tightened around the reins. "I mean that plain," he said. "I ain't the kind to say it if I don't mean it." She turned toward the cabin, the field, the fence. "You built all this, alone, mostly. Had a neighbor help me lift the roof beam, but the rest, that's my sweat in that dirt." She stepped closer to the fence. "I don't want to live quiet anymore," she said. "Not like I was hiding." You don't have to, he said gently. She turned to him, her voice low. If I build something, I want it to be W with someone who sees me. I see you, Maebry. I did the first time you stepped off that coach. The horses shifted behind them. A meadowlark sang from the tree line. She took a breath. I want to stay, not just here, but with you. His eyes softened. Then come back next Sunday. I'll show you how to plant beans. We'll start with dirt and see where it goes. She nodded, and this time when she smiled, it reached her eyes. They rode back as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the trail. When they reached the edge of town, she turned in the saddle just before parting. I'll bring biscuits, Kallen grinned. Then I'll make coffee. She watched him ride off toward the saddlery, the sound of hoofbeats fading under the hush of the coming twilight. Her hands didn't tremble as she held the reins. The first Sunday morning she rode out to the cabin, Maebry brought the biscuits wrapped in a square of muslin, still warm from the stove. She had woken before dawn, not out of nerves though they hummed low in her chest, but because she wanted the dough to rise properly. She rode alone this time, her posture steadier in the saddle than the week before, the dappled gelding remembering her hands. Kallen was already outside when she arrived, sleeves rolled up, hauling a sack of seed from the shed to a patch of earth he had turned over with a spade. He lifted his head when she approached and wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist. You came, he said. She dismounted and held out the bundle, still warm. He took it with both hands, careful. You didn't need to rise early for me. I wanted to, she said, brushing dust off her skirt. He opened the cloth and broke one biscuit in half without a word. They sat on a flat stone near the edge of the field, eating without rush, the sound of birds cutting through the morning stillness. Afterward, he handed her a tin pail. Waters from the creek, want to help me soak the rows? She nodded and followed him, her boots sinking a little in the tilled soil. The earth was darker here, softer than the scrubland around town. She crouched when he did, watching how he poured water into the shallow furrows. Seeds go in dry, he said. But water helps the roots reach down when they start. She worked beside him, quiet but focused, the hem of her dress catching on the edge of a root. He reached to free it, then let his hand fall away without touching her skin. What will we plant today? She asked. Pinto beans and early squash, he said. Might get a second round before the frost if we're lucky. They fell into rhythm, trading the pail, pressing seeds into the damp earth. His hands were rough from years of leather and rope, hers bore ink stains and the faint ridges left by chalk. Neither of them spoke much while working. It wasn't silence, it was ease. When they finished the last row, he stood and stretched, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat. She brushed her palms off on her apron and looked out across their work. The rows were crooked in places where her hands had faltered, but Kallen didn't correct them. Not bad for a schoolteacher, he said. She smiled. Not be bad for a cowboy, he chuckled, low and warm. You're braver than most men I know. She looked at him then, surprised. You came out here alone. You stayed, he said. Some folks don't even try. Maebry turned her gaze back to the cabin. Didn't feel brave, just felt like I didn't have anywhere else to go. You do now, he said. He didn't say more, but his meaning sat between them, clear as a stone. They walked back to the cabin, dust clinging to their boots. He brought out a tin of honey and split another biscuit. She let the honey drip onto her half, then passed it back. You ever think about teaching women? He asked. She raised her brow. What kind of women? Ones who never learned their letters. My neighbor's wife Ellen never went to school, can't read a label from a ledger. She's ashamed to say so. Maebry considered that. I could try if they're willing. They'd listen to you, he said. You don't talk down to anyone. She looked down at the crust of biscuit in her hand. I know how that feels, being talked over. He reached for her hand, not sudden, just steady. Their fingers laced slow, the warmth of his palm grounding her. I've been thinking, he said. If the beans take, I'll need more hands come harvest. She tilted her head. You offering me work or something more? Both, he said. If you'll have it. The breeze stirred the pine needles beside the porch. A sparrow darted past, wings flashing. I want to build something, she said. Not just a life, a place where people don't feel small. You already are, he said. Right here. She cleared her throat, but the tears that rose weren't from sadness. Then I'd like to stay. He leaned in slow, the brim of his hat brushing hers as he kissed her again, this time with the shape of a promise. Behind them, the field soaked in the last of the water as the morning sun climbed higher, and nothing in Maebry's chest felt heavy anymore. By early June, the beans had sprouted thick and green, their leaves catching the morning dew like cupped hands. Maebry walked the rows barefoot that day, her skirts pinned up as she moved between the shoots, careful not to disturb the soil. Kallen leaned on the fence, chewing a stem of dry grass, watching her without speaking. "Something wrong?" she asked, brushing her calf with her palm where a burr had caught. "Just thinkin'," he said. She crossed the last furrow and stood beside him, frowning slightly. "About what?" He let the grass slip from his mouth. "About the ridge west of here. There's a meadow up that way past the junipers. Flat ground, good light. I was wonderin' if it might suit a second cabin." Maebry slid an arm across the top rail, leaning beside him. "You want to build again?" "I want to build for you," he said. "Something that's yours from the nails up." Her throat tightened, but she nodded once, slow and certain. That afternoon, they walked the ridge together. The climb was steady, the air cooler under the taller trees. When they came to the clearing, she stopped, turning in a slow circle. The grass bent in the breeze, thick with purple thistle and yellow prairie clover. From where she stood, she could see the line of the bighorns rising in the distance. "I could teach here," she said, her voice hushed. "Start a circle for the women. Lessons on Sundays, maybe." He looked sideways at her. "You think they'd come? They come for the market, for church. They'd come for each other." He squatted down, picked a flake of quartz from the dirt, and studied it. "You've got a mind that works like water. Finds its way through." She knelt beside him. "You find your way too, just not with words." "Never needed many," he said. "Not till you." Back at the cabin, he showed her how to check the saddle cinch, how to oil the reins so they didn't crack with heat. She watched his hands, how they moved with quiet certainty. "You always this patient?" she asked, drying her hands on her apron. He shook his head. "Only with you." They sat on the stoop after supper. The sky was turning the color of buttermilk, stars just beginning to show. A coyote called somewhere far off. Maebry rested her head against his shoulder. "I can't remember the last time I felt still. You've been running a long time," he said. "Even when you stood still," she nodded. "I don't feel like I have to anymore." He laid his hand over hers. "Then we'll build slow, no hurry." She turned her face up toward him. "I don't want slow, Kallen, not with you." He met her gaze, his voice low. "What do you want then?" "I want a life, with dirt under my nails, with a table that's ours, not borrowed. I want to wake up and know you're there." He brought his forehead to hers, breath warm against her cheek. "Then that's what we'll have." That night, she stayed in the cabin. He laid a pallet across from the hearth, gave her the quilt he used in winter, and she tucked herself beneath it without hesitation. The fire crackled low, throwing soft orange light across the beams. Before sleep took her, she whispered across the dark, "You ever afraid?" "Only of not getting back to you," he said. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, her dreams held no echoes of shame, only the steady weight of his promise and the quiet, growing certainty of love. July settled over the land with heat that clung to skin and filled every breath. The beans had flowered, pale blossoms tucked beneath broad leaves, and the squash vines crawled wide and low between their rows. Maebry stood barefoot in the doorway of the unfinished cabin on the ridge, her hands stained from smoothing mud along the chinking between the logs. Kallen's hammer rang steady behind her, each strike measured, never hurried. The walls had come up fast once the foundation dried, and though only 2 windows were framed and the roof was still open to the sky, the place already held a shape that felt like belonging. "You're stronger than you look," he said, setting his hammer down and wiping his brow with his sleeve. "I carried Bibles and grammar books through snow. You think a few logs would stop me?" She tucked a loose strand of hair under her kerchief, her cheeks ruddy from the sun. He gathered the short ladder from where it leaned against the outer wall and propped it under the roof beam. "You want to pass me that tin box? I'll finish the ridge nails before light fades." She brought it to him without comment and held the ladder steady as he climbed, her eyes following the line of his back as he worked. Once he climbed down, she didn't let go of the ladder right away. "I've been thinking about a stove," she said. "One with a flat iron top wide enough for a full pan of cornbread and a kettle beside it." "You'll have it," he said. "I'll bring one from Casper when I ride in for the horseshoes next week." She nodded, lips pressed together. "I want to be ready before frost. I want to winter here, you will, and I want us to be married before then." Kallen looked at her, his gaze quiet and certain. "I was hoppin' you'd ask." They stood like that for a while, the breeze catching the flap of the muslin she'd hung where the front door would be. She reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation, their fingers knotting together like roots growing into shared soil. The wedding happened 3 Sundays later, just after the sun crested the ridge. It was small, held beneath the cottonwoods near the creek, with Ellen from the neighboring homestead sewing Maebry's dress, and the children from town bringing flowers they'd gathered themselves. The parson from Powder River rode in dusty but glad to oblige. Maebry wore a crown of sage blossoms and stood without trembling as she said her vows aloud. Her voice caught only once, and no one laughed. Kallen's hand stayed wrapped around hers the whole time, steady as wind-worn stone. Afterward, they walked back to the cabin as man and wife. He carried her across the unfinished threshold, though she protested, and they laughed, the sound ringing out over the fresh-cut pine and open sky. Inside, the bed was made with her quilt, and a small table stood by the window, already holding a tin cup with wildflowers. She leaned against the wall, watching him light the single oil lamp they owned. "I used to think I'd live my life in quiet corners," she said. "Always on the edge of things." "You're the center of it now," he answered. That night, as the last light faded, they lay beneath the open rafters, the stars visible through the gaps where the shingles would go. She curled into him, her ear against his chest, his thumb tracing slow circles on her shoulder. "I want to teach my own children," she said softly. "Someday, here you will," he said. "And they'll know who they come from." She closed her eyes, the sound of crickets rising outside, and breathed in the scent of pine dust and sweat in him. The first frost came early that year, but the squash had already cured and the beans dried well. They strung them together with twine and hung them from the beams to dry. Kallen finished the roof before the snow, and the stove arrived by wagon, just as promised. By December, the cabin was warm and full. Women from the valley came once a week for lessons, sitting on benches Kallen built from leftover lumber. Maebry taught them to sign their names, to write letters to sisters back east, to read the verses their children brought home from the Red Butt school. Ellen came every time, her hands rough from milking, but she learned fast. One afternoon, she stayed behind and pressed a wrapped bundle into Maebry's hands, 2 books, one of folk medicines, one of recipes, both copied in careful script. "I couldn't have done it without your help," she said, eyes shining. Maebry placed the books on the shelf beside the family Bible. "You always could. You just needed someone to tell you so." That night, Kallen came in from the barn with snow on his shoulders and news that the old cottonwood by the creek had split in the wind. "It'll need clearing come spring," he said, pulling off his gloves. She poured him coffee and handed him the ledger where she tracked the household goods. "We'll plant where it stood, maybe carrots this time," he kissed her temple. "Whatever you want, we'll grow it." She leaned into his side, the fire warm against their legs. "I used to fear the stillness," she said. "Now I want to stay in it forever." "You're not still," he said. "You're just rooted now." Outside, the snow fell soft and slow, blanketing the ridge and the field where the beans had grown. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight, the smell of cornbread rising from the stove, and the quiet joy of a life built not from noise or speed, but from care. Maebry and Kallen Oakes lived out their days on that ridge side by side, season by season, turning soil, raising children, and teaching others to find strength in their own quiet voices. They loved without fear, without rush, and without end.